The sun was setting over the bustling city, casting a golden hue on the crowded streets. People moved hurriedly in every direction, caught up in their own lives, unaware of the stories unfolding around them. Among the stream of pedestrians was Daniel, a man in his mid-30s, well-dressed and focused, his mind consumed by the usual worries of work deadlines, financial pressures, and the endless to-do list that seemed to govern his life. He was just another face in the crowd, another person trying to make it through the day. As Daniel approached the busy intersection, he noticed a small figure on the sidewalk. It was a boy, no older than 10 or 11, his clothes worn and dirty, his hair matted, and his face streaked with the grime of the streets. The boy's eyes were large and hollow, filled with a weariness far beyond his years. He stood there, awkwardly, just on the edge of the flow of people, as if unsure whether he belonged in the throng or not. "Excuse me, sir," the boy called out softly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the traffic and the chatter of the crowd. He was holding something in his hand, something small, though Daniel couldn't quite make out what it was. The boy took a hesitant step forward, his expression a mixture of hope and desperation. Daniel glanced at him briefly, but his stride didn't falter. He was late. His boss had called an impromptu meeting, and he couldn't afford to be distracted. Besides, the city was full of people like this, people who had fallen through the cracks, people who were always asking for help. He had been taught to be cautious, to avoid getting involved. It wasn't his problem. The boy moved closer, his hand outstretched now, revealing the object he was holding, a small, tattered stuffed animal. "Please, sir," he said again, his voice trembling just slightly, as though he wasn't used to asking for anything. "Can you help me? I'm lost. I don't know where to go." Daniel quickened his pace, pretending not to hear. He'd learned to tune out these kinds of pleas over the years, becoming numb to them as part of living in the city. There were too many people in need, too many stories of hardship, and if he stopped for every one of them, he'd never get anywhere. He told himself that it wasn't his responsibility to fix the world's problems. Everyone had their own struggles. The boy didn't follow him. He just stood there, watching as Daniel merged back into the crowd, his hands slowly lowering to his side. For a brief moment, Daniel felt a pang of guilt, a flicker of something that made him want to turn back, but the moment passed quickly. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Another email from work, another task demanding his attention. There was no time for distractions that he convinced himself that someone else would help the boy. Surely, in a city this large, there were people better equipped to deal with situations like this. Social workers, charities, even the police, someone would come along. It wasn't his job to get involved. He was just an ordinary man after all. What could he do? The intersection grew smaller behind him as Daniel walked on, his mind already shifting back to his own concerns. He had to make sure his presentation was ready for the meeting. He needed to check in with his accountant about his taxes. And didn't he promise his sister he'd call her about their mother's birthday plans? The list of things he needed to do seemed endless, and helping a random street child didn't make the cut. But as much as Daniel tried to push the encounter out of his mind, the image of the boy lingered. Those eyes, so wide and pleading, haunted him for a moment. They seemed so out of place in such a young face, filled with an understanding of hardship that no child should ever have to know. Daniel shook his head, dismissing the thought. It was nothing. The boy would be fine. He probably had a family somewhere nearby. These kids always had some kind of story, some reason to pull at your heartstrings. As the evening deepened, Daniel finally arrived at his office building. He checked his watch just in time. The receptionist greeted him with a polite nod as he hurried to the elevator, and he gave her a quick smile, though his mind was already elsewhere. By the time he reached the conference room, he had fully compartmentalized the day's events, neatly tucking the encounter with the street child into a distant corner of his mind. The meeting went on for hours, longer than expected, with discussion after discussion about sales targets, marketing strategies, and customer engagement. Daniel took notes, contributed ideas, and nodded at all the right moments, though there were times when his focus wavered. Every now and then, the boy's face would flash in his memory, but he quickly suppressed it, reminding himself that it didn't matter. He was here to do his job, to succeed in his career, and that required focus to be why the time the meeting ended. It was well after dark, and Daniel was exhausted. He gathered his things and left the office, stepping out into the cool night air. The streets were quieter now, with fewer people milling about, but the city was never truly silent. As he walked back toward the subway, his thoughts drifted once more to the boy. He wondered, fleetingly, if the child had found help or if he was still out there, lost and alone. But Daniel didn't stop to dwell on it. He had done what he always did. He moved on, focusing on the next task, the next responsibility. That's what life in the city demanded, after all. You kept moving, kept pushing forward, because if you didn't, you'd be swallowed up by the endless tide of demands and distractions. The encounter with the street child faded further into the background as the days went by. Daniel returned to his routine. Wake up early, head to the office, work through meetings, handle emails, come home late, and repeat. His life was a cycle of productivity, efficiency, and achievement, with little room for anything outside of his carefully constructed world. He convinced himself that this was the way it had to be. Yet, every so often, late at night when he lay in bed, the boy's face would appear in his mind's eye, unbidden and unwelcome. Daniel would push it away, telling himself it was just a fleeting memory, nothing more. He had done nothing wrong. It wasn't his responsibility. But no matter how hard he tried to shake it, the image of those wide, pleading eyes lingered, haunting him in the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts. Unbeknownst to Daniel, the story of the street child was far from over. The next morning, Daniel woke up feeling restless, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. It was a familiar unease, the kind that lingered just below the surface, not strong enough to disrupt his day, but always there, like background noise that never fades. He attributed it to stress. Work had been relentless lately, and the pressure of meeting deadlines was gnawing at him more than usual. But he got ready as he always did: shower, coffee, checking his phone for the latest string of emails before he was even fully dressed. His life was a carefully planned sequence of routines, each step designed to maximize efficiency. There wasn't much time for reflection, and that was how he preferred it. The faster he moved, the less he had to think about anything that didn't fit neatly into his schedule. But today, something was different. As Daniel rode the subway to work, his mind wandered, and to his dismay, it kept drifting back to the boy. The brief encounter he'd had the day before, just a few seconds in the grand scheme of things, was replaying in his head, uninvited. He could still see the boy standing there on the sidewalk, holding that ragged stuffed animal, eyes full of some mixture of fear and hope that made Daniel uncomfortable. That it was strange, he thought, how one moment could linger so persistently. He had ignored countless people on the street before. Homeless men and women, beggars, the occasional child selling cheap trinkets or asking for spare change. It was just part of city life. You couldn't help everyone, and you couldn't stop for every sad story you saw, or you'd never make it through the day. But this time felt different. There was something about that boy that Daniel couldn't shake, something that gnawed at him even now as the subway rattled along its tracks. He found himself wondering if the child had made it home, if someone else had stopped to help him after Daniel had walked away. Maybe the boy had been picked up by a kind stranger, or maybe he had simply returned to wherever he came from, another night spent on the streets. Daniel tried to push the thoughts aside, telling himself that it didn't matter. He had made a decision in the moment, a decision he would have made any other day. There was no point in second-guessing it now. He wasn't the type to dwell on things like this. He wasn't one of those people who got caught up in the emotions of strangers, letting every sob story weigh them down. He had learned long ago that the world was full of people in need, and you couldn't save them all. Still, as he got off the subway and started walking toward his office building, Daniel couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. It was a foreign sensation to him, one that he wasn't used to. Guilt was something he had long trained himself to avoid. His life was built on practicality, on doing what made sense in the moment. If someone needed help and he couldn't give it, then that was simply the way things were. He didn't have time to let guilt slow him down. But the boy's face, those eyes, kept intruding on his thoughts. He could still see the way the child had looked at him, as if Daniel was his last hope. The memory gnawed at him in a way that no other interaction with a stranger ever had. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt the uncomfortable pull of regret that he arrived at work, grateful for the distractions that awaited him there. The day promised to be busy, with meetings lined up from morning until late afternoon. It was the kind of schedule Daniel thrived on, one that left little room for introspection. He threw himself into his tasks with a singular focus, answering emails, reviewing reports, and preparing for his next big presentation. But no matter how hard he tried to immerse himself in work, the boy lingered in the back of his mind, like a shadow he couldn't shake. As the hours dragged on, Daniel found himself becoming increasingly irritated by his own inability to forget. Why was this bothering him so much? It wasn't as if he had done anything wrong. He had simply made a choice to keep walking, like countless others had probably done before and after him. During a lull between meetings, Daniel sat at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he wasn't typing. Instead, his thoughts were once again consumed by that brief encounter on the street. What if he had stopped? What if he had taken just a minute to talk to the boy, to ask him what he needed? Would it have made any difference? Maybe the child really was lost. Maybe he didn't know where to go, and Daniel could have helped him find his way home. Or maybe it was all a scam, a ploy to get money or sympathy, like so many other stories he had heard on the streets. He couldn't know for sure, but that uncertainty was precisely what bothered him. He didn't know, and because he didn't know, he couldn't let it go. Daniel glanced at the clock. He still had a few minutes before his next meeting, so he stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. From this height, the streets seemed so far away, the people tiny and insignificant, like ants scurrying about their business. It was hard to believe that just yesterday, he had been down there, walking among them, completely oblivious to the boy's fate. For a brief moment, Daniel considered going back to the place where he had seen the child. Maybe he could check if the boy was still there if he needed help. But the thought quickly evaporated. It was ridiculous, he told himself. What were the chances the boy would still be there? And even if he was, what could Daniel do now? It wasn't as if he had the power to change anything. He wasn't a hero, just a man trying to get through his day. That he returned to his desk and forced himself to focus on the tasks at hand. There were clients waiting on him, deadlines to meet, and projects to complete. His work was important, and he couldn't afford to let his mind wander any longer. He had responsibilities, and those responsibilities didn't include helping random street kids. But the feeling of guilt, the nagging sense that he had failed in some small but significant way, refused to leave him. That night, after a long day at the office, Daniel came home to his apartment, exhausted but still restless. He made himself dinner, something quick and simple, and sat down in front of the TV, hoping to lose himself in a show or a movie. But nothing seemed to hold his attention. Every time he tried to relax, his thoughts would circle back to the boy, to the moment he had walked away. Daniel stood up and paced the room, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. He told himself that this was just a passing mood, that he would feel better in the morning. He always did. A good night's sleep was all he needed, and by tomorrow, he would have forgotten about the boy completely. But as the night wore on, Daniel found it increasingly difficult to sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't control. What if the boy had been in real danger? What if Daniel's decision to walk away had left him stranded, vulnerable, with no one else to turn to? It was absurd, he knew that. He wasn't responsible for every lost child in the city. But the question lingered. What if sleep didn't come easily that night? Daniel tossed and turned, his thoughts spinning in circles, chasing questions without answers. He had never been the kind of person to dwell on things like this, to let his emotions get the better of him. But something about this encounter had shaken him in a way he didn't understand, and as the hours ticked by, Daniel found himself replaying the scene over and over in his head, wondering what he could have done differently. He imagined himself stopping, talking to the boy, offering to help. Maybe he could have called someone, a social worker or the police. Maybe he could have given the boy directions, or even just listened to his story. But none of that mattered now. The moment had passed, and Daniel had made his choice. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted into a fitful sleep. But even in his dreams, the boy's face haunted him, a constant reminder of the decision he couldn't undo. The next day, Daniel woke up feeling drained, as if he hadn't slept at all. The unease that had plagued him the day before was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. He tried to shake it off as he went about his morning routine, but the memory of the boy clung to him. Persistent and unrelenting, as he left his apartment and headed to work, Daniel couldn't help but glance around the streets, half expecting to see the child again. But of course, the boy was nowhere to be found. The city had already swallowed him up, just as it did with so many others. Life moved on, indifferent to the small tragedies that unfolded every day. Daniel told himself that it was time to move on too. He couldn't let this one moment define him, couldn't let it drag him down. But even as he tried to convince himself of that, a part of him knew that something had shifted. The boy's face, his plea for help, had pierced through the carefully constructed walls Daniel had built around himself. And now those walls were crumbling. Little by little, he didn't know what to do with that realization, didn't know how to make sense of the emotions that were churning inside him. All he knew was that something inside him had changed, and there was no going back. The following few days passed by in a blur, each one identical to the last. Daniel's life returned to its usual rhythm of work, meetings, and the occasional social gathering with colleagues or friends. On the surface, everything seemed back to normal, but beneath the facade of his neatly ordered routine, a persistent unease lingered, like a stone in his shoe that he couldn't shake out. He had done his best to bury the thoughts of the boy he had ignored on the street, pushing the memory to the back of his mind as much as possible. But no matter how hard he tried, the boy's face wouldn't leave him. In the quieter moments, when the demands of the day faded and he was left alone with his thoughts, that same image resurfaced. The child, standing on the sidewalk, eyes wide and filled with a quiet desperation. It was a look that seemed to follow him, to haunt him. Daniel had always prided himself on being rational, on making practical decisions and focusing on what was directly in front of him. He didn't let emotion cloud his judgment. And yet, here he was days later, still unable to forget that fleeting moment. He had passed hundreds of strangers in the city over the years, people in all sorts of circumstances, but this one encounter stuck with him like a splinter in his mind. One evening, after another long day at the office, Daniel came home to his apartment, exhausted but restless. The city outside was alive with the usual hum of activity, the distant roar of traffic, the murmur of voices, the occasional blaring horn. He dropped his keys on the kitchen counter and turned on the television, hoping to distract himself. The evening news was on, the familiar faces of the anchors discussing the latest stories of the day, political scandals, economic reports, a feel-good segment about a local hero. Daniel wasn't really paying attention. His mind was elsewhere, still preoccupied with the guilt that gnawed at him. He flipped absent-mindedly through his phone, scrolling through social media, reading messages, trying to push away the unease that had settled in his chest. The news droned on in the background, voices fading into white noise. But then, something caught his attention. His gaze flicked up to the television screen, and his heart seemed to skip a beat. The image that filled the screen was unmistakable. It was the face of the boy. Daniel froze, his phone slipping from his hand and landing on the couch beside him. For a moment, he thought he was imagining it, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But no, there it was, clear as day. The same face, the same hollow, pleading eyes. It was the boy from the street, but he felt a chill run through him, a sense of foreboding creeping into his veins. The news anchor was speaking, her voice calm and professional, but the words seemed to cut through the air like a knife. Police are continuing their investigation into the disappearance of 12-year-old Lucas Reyes, who was last seen earlier this week in the downtown area. Authorities are asking anyone with information to come forward. The boy was wearing a red hoodie and gray pants at the time of his disappearance. His family is urging the public to assist in the search. Daniel's mind reeled, the words barely registering as he stared at the screen. Lucas Reyes. He had a name now, and he was missing. The image of the boy lingered on the screen for a moment longer before cutting to footage of his distraught mother, tearfully pleading with anyone who might have seen him to contact the police. She was clutching a photograph of her son, her hands trembling, her voice breaking with emotion. Daniel watched in stunned silence, his heart pounding in his chest. The room seemed to close in around him, the air thick with a weight he couldn't quite describe. His thoughts raced, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. That boy, the one he had ignored, Lucas Reyes, was missing, and Daniel had seen him, had walked right past him, had chosen to do nothing that a wave of nausea washed over him as the reality of the situation sank in. He had been there. He had been one of the last people to see this boy, and he had done nothing. All the rationalizations he had told himself in the days since, the excuses about not having time, about it not being his problem, crumbled away, leaving only the cold, hard truth that he had ignored a child in need. And now that child was gone. Daniel stood up abruptly, pacing the small living room, his thoughts spiraling out of control. His mind replayed the scene over and over again. The brief encounter on the street, the way the boy had looked at him, the way he had walked away without a second thought. What if Lucas had been trying to get home? What if he had been lost or scared, and Daniel had been his only chance for help? What if Daniel's indifference had cost the boy his safety? The guilt that had been simmering inside him for days now erupted into full-blown panic. He felt like he couldn't breathe, his chest tight with anxiety. He had to do something. He had to fix this. Without thinking, Daniel grabbed his phone and opened the browser, searching for more information on the disappearance. The search results flooded in, article after article detailing Lucas's case. There were reports from local news outlets, posts on social media from people trying to raise awareness, and even a community-led search effort that had begun after the boy had been reported missing. The timeline of events sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Lucas had been last seen in the very area where Daniel had encountered him. It was all too close, too coincidental. Daniel felt his hands trembling as he scrolled through the information, reading every detail with mounting dread. The boy had been missing for days now, and with each passing hour, the chances of finding him safe dwindled that Daniel's thoughts were racing, his mind a chaotic storm of guilt, fear, and desperation. He had to do something, but what? Should he go to the police? Should he tell them what he had seen, what he had done? Would it even matter at this point? It wasn't like he had any useful information. All he knew was that he had seen Lucas, that he had ignored him. It felt like too little, too late. But as the weight of the situation pressed down on him, Daniel knew he couldn't just stand by anymore. He couldn't continue to pretend that this wasn't his problem, that he wasn't somehow involved in this boy's fate. He had made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and now he had to do something, anything, to make it right. That he picked up his phone again and dialed the number for the local police department. His hands were shaking as he held the phone to his ear, waiting for someone to pick up. His mind was racing with what he would say, how he would explain himself. He felt a deep pit of dread in his stomach, the weight of his own failure pressing down on him. When the dispatcher answered, Daniel's voice came out shaky and unsure. I need to report something," he stammered. "About the missing boy, Lucas Reyes. I think I saw him a few days ago." The words felt heavy on his tongue, like a confession. He could feel the guilt bubbling up inside him, threatening to overwhelm him, but he pushed through it. He had to do this. He had to try and help, even if it felt like he was too late. The dispatcher asked for more details, and Daniel did his best to explain what he had seen. He described the moment when Lucas had approached him, the way the boy had asked for help, the way Daniel had walked away. He told them everything, his voice cracking with emotion as he realized just how badly he had failed. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The dispatcher asked a few more questions, and Daniel answered them as best he could, though he didn't have much to offer. He hadn't asked Lucas where he was going, hadn't taken the time to find out what he needed. All he had was a vague memory of the boy's face and the overwhelming regret that came with knowing he could have done more. When the call ended, Daniel collapsed onto the couch, feeling utterly drained. His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind still spinning with guilt and fear. He had done what he could, but it didn't feel like enough. It felt like he had already failed, and no matter what he did now, it wouldn't change the fact that Lucas was missing because Daniel hadn't stopped to help him. For the next few hours, Daniel sat in front of the TV, watching the news coverage of Lucas's disappearance with a heavy heart. Every time the boy's face appeared on the screen, Daniel felt that familiar pang of guilt, the knowledge that he had been there and done nothing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was responsible, that if he had just stopped and listened, Lucas might not be missing right now. As the night wore on, the news coverage continued, with updates from the police and interviews with Lucas's family. His mother appeared again, tearfully pleading for her son's safe return, her voice raw with emotion. Daniel felt a lump in his throat as he watched her, the weight of his own guilt nearly suffocating him. What if Lucas was never found? What if this was his fault? The questions haunted him, echoing in his mind long after the news had ended. He couldn't escape the reality of what had happened, couldn't shake the knowledge that he had failed when it mattered most. And now, all he could do was wait. Wait for news, wait for some kind of resolution. The news of Lucas Reyes' disappearance had shaken Daniel to his core. In the days that followed his call to the police, his life became a blur of anxious waiting, sleepless nights, and mounting guilt. He had done what he could, or so he told himself, but it felt like no matter how hard he tried to rationalize his actions, the crushing weight of regret refused to leave him. Every night, he would sit in front of the TV, watching the news for updates, hoping, no, praying, that somehow, against all odds, Lucas would be found, that he would be safe, that this nightmare, this gnawing feeling in Daniel's chest, would come to an end. But the days passed, and with each newscast that brought no updates, Daniel's hope began to wane. The city carried on with its usual chaotic rhythm, but for him, everything felt muted, distant. His mind was consumed by thoughts of the boy. Each new day was another reminder of the moment he had failed to act, another day where Lucas was still missing, still out there. Somewhere Daniel's work began to suffer. The meticulous order of his life, the structure he had always relied on to keep things in control, seemed to unravel at the seams. His once pristine inbox became a cluttered mess of unanswered emails and missed deadlines. In meetings, his colleagues noticed his distracted demeanor, the way his eyes would glaze over mid-conversation, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. "Hey man, you doing all right?" It was his boss, David, who finally pulled him aside one afternoon after a particularly disjointed presentation. Daniel had stumbled through his slides, forgetting key points, unable to focus on the task at hand. "I'm fine," Daniel had replied, but the words felt hollow, even to him. He wasn't fine, not even close. But what could he say? That he was haunted by a boy he had ignored on the street? That his failure to help might have led to a child's disappearance? It felt too surreal to explain, too heavy to share. David eyed him with concern, but didn't press further. "Take some time if you need it. Clear your head," he said, his tone softer than usual. "We all need a break sometimes." Daniel nodded, offering a weak smile in return, but the suggestion felt like a distant solution to a problem that was far too immediate, far too personal. What he needed wasn't a break. It was answers. And every day that went by, without them, only deepened the pit in his stomach. The nights were worse. Alone in his apartment, with nothing to distract him from his thoughts, Daniel's mind would spiral. He couldn't escape the questions, the what-ifs. What if Lucas had been trying to find his way home? What if he had been in danger, and Daniel had been the only person who could have helped him? What if he was still out there, scared and alone, because Daniel had walked away? He would replay that moment on the street over and over in his mind, searching for some way to make sense of it. But no matter how hard he tried, the result was always the same. He had failed. He had failed Lucas, and now the boy was gone. One night, as he sat in his living room, staring blankly at the TV screen, a knock on the door startled him out of his thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone. His heart rate spiked, a mix of anxiety and curiosity swirling in his chest. He stood up slowly, the sound of his own footsteps unnervingly loud in the silence of the apartment. Opening the door, Daniel was surprised to see two figures standing there, a man and a woman, both dressed in plain, professional clothing. Their expressions were serious, but not unkind. "Mr. Saunders?" the woman asked, her tone polite but firm. "Yes," Daniel replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Detective Rivera, and this is my partner, Detective Morgan," she continued, flashing a badge. "We're with the Missing Persons Unit. We'd like to ask you a few questions about Lucas Reyes." For a moment, Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He had expected this, hadn't he? Ever since he'd made the call to the police, he had known this day might come. But now, standing face to face with the detectives, the reality of it hit him harder than he had anticipated. "Of course," he managed to say, stepping aside to let them in. The detectives entered the apartment, their eyes scanning the room briefly before turning their attention back to him. Detective Rivera gestured toward the couch. "May we sit?" Daniel nodded, motioning for them to take a seat. He sat down across from them, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, anxiety coursing through him like an electric current. "We understand that you contacted the police a few days ago, saying you believe you may have seen Lucas Reyes before he disappeared," Detective Morgan said, his voice calm but direct. "Yes," Daniel replied, swallowing hard. I saw him. I'm sure it was him. Can you walk us through what happened that day?" Rivera asked, her eyes steady on his face. From the beginning, Daniel took a deep breath, his mind racing to gather his thoughts. He explained everything, starting with his walk down the street, the moment when Lucas had approached him, the way the boy had asked for help. His voice faltered as he described his decision to walk away, the guilt of that choice still fresh, still raw. The detectives listened intently, neither interrupting him nor judging him, but Daniel could feel the weight of their silence. When he finished, the room seemed to hang in the stillness of his words. I didn't know," Daniel said quietly, his voice strained. "I thought he might have been like so many others on the street, asking for money or, I don't know. I didn't stop. And now," Rivera nodded slowly, her face unreadable. "We understand, Mr. Saunders. Unfortunately, situations like this are complicated, and it's not always clear what the right thing to do is in the moment. But you did the right thing by coming forward," Morgan added, his voice softer now, almost reassuring. "The information you've given us is important. It helps us build a clearer picture of Lucas's last known movements." Daniel wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had given them information, yes, but was it really helpful? Could it possibly make up for what he had failed to do that day? The doubt gnawed at him, even as the detectives thanked him for his time and stood to leave. "Please, if you remember anything else, don't hesitate to contact us," Rivera said as they made their way to the door. "Anything, no matter how small, could be important." "I will," Daniel replied, though the words felt empty. He watched as they left, closing the door behind them with a quiet click. For a long time, Daniel just stood there in the silence of his apartment, staring at the closed door. He had expected the detectives to come, but their visit had only amplified the questions swirling in his mind. What more could he have done? What was his role in all of this? Could his actions, or lack thereof, really make a difference now? That night, Daniel slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of Lucas's face, of those pleading eyes staring at him in the darkness. Every time he closed his eyes, the same scene would play out. Lucas standing before him, asking for help, and Daniel walking away, leaving him behind. It felt like there was no escape. The following morning, Daniel woke up groggy, his mind still clouded with guilt and confusion. He went through the motions of his morning routine, coffee, shower, checking emails, but everything felt distant, disconnected. The usual rhythm of his life had been disrupted, and nothing felt right anymore, that he found himself searching for news updates again, scrolling through the internet, hoping for any sign of Lucas. But there was nothing new. The boy was still missing, and the search continued, but with each passing day, the likelihood of finding him seemed to grow slimmer. Then, one afternoon, just as Daniel was about to leave his apartment, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news alert, something about the Lucas Reyes case. His heart leaped into his throat as he opened the notification, his hands trembling. The headline hit him like a punch to the gut. Body found in river identified as missing boy, Lucas Reyes. For a moment, Daniel couldn't breathe. The words blurred in front of his eyes as the reality of what he was reading sank in. Lucas was dead. The boy he had ignored, the boy he had failed to help, was gone. Found in a river, lifeless, lost to the city that had swallowed him whole. Daniel collapsed onto the couch, his phone slipping from his hand. The weight of the news crashed over him like a tidal wave, pulling him under, suffocating him in a sea of guilt and regret. His chest ached with the enormity of it, the finality of it. Lucas was gone, and Daniel couldn't help but feel that it was his fault, that in the days that followed, the details of Lucas's death began to emerge. The boy had been found by a group of hikers near the outskirts of the city, his body partially submerged in the river that wound its way through the dense woods. The police were investigating, but no foul play had been determined yet. There were questions, of course. How had Lucas ended up there? What had happened to him in the days after he disappeared? But for now, those questions remained unanswered, leaving only grief and uncertainty in their wake. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about Lucas. His mind replayed the news over and over again, the terrible, unshakable reality of the boy's fate. He tried to push it away, tried to focus on work, on anything else, but it was no use. Everywhere he turned, there was Lucas's face, staring at him from the depths of his own guilt. The city, with all its noise and chaos, felt suffocating now. The streets, once familiar and comforting in their anonymity, now seemed haunted by the memory of the boy he had ignored. Every homeless person he passed, every child he saw walking alone, was a reminder of Lucas, a reminder of his failure. Daniel began to withdraw from the world around him. He stopped going out with friends, stopped responding to messages. Even work, which had once been his refuge, became unbearable. His colleagues noticed, of course. They tried to reach out, tried to offer support, but Daniel couldn't bring himself to explain what was really going on. How could he tell them that he felt responsible for a boy's death? The days blurred together, one after the other, each one more painful than the last. Daniel couldn't escape the weight of his own guilt, couldn't find a way to move forward. He felt trapped, suffocated by the knowledge that he had failed when it mattered most. And Lucas was dead because of it. One evening, weeks after the news of Lucas's death had broken, Daniel found himself standing on the same street where he had first encountered the boy. The city around him was alive with its usual hustle and bustle, but Daniel felt strangely detached from it all, as if he were watching from a distance. That he stood there, staring at the spot where Lucas had stood, remembering the moment when the boy had asked for help, the moment when Daniel had walked away. The guilt was overwhelming, but in that moment, something else began to stir within him, a realization, a painful truth that he had been avoiding for weeks. He couldn't change what had happened. He couldn't bring Lucas back, but maybe, just maybe, he could do something to make sure it didn't happen again. Asterisk, it wasn't much, but it was a start. Daniel didn't know what the future held, didn't know if he would ever truly forgive himself for what had happened. But as he stood there, in the midst of the bustling city, he made a promise to himself, a promise that he wouldn't turn away again. Not this time.